In the autumn of 1879, people across the eastern edge of Dakota Territory watched a widow do something they could not understand. Margaret Ostrom was cutting sod, not breaking ground for a garden, not patching a soft spot in her roof, not preparing a corner of pasture for spring. She was cutting sod in long, careful strips and carrying every piece back toward the small log cabin her husband had finished building only the summer before he died. Her 10-year-old son, Henrik, walked behind her with a battered tin pail, gathering loose tufts of grass and prairie root. An old gray cat named Myra followed at a distance, weaving between the cut blocks like she belonged to the work. By the end of the second day, a low ridge of turf had begun rising along the north wall of the cabin. By the end of the first week, the ridge had climbed past the window line. That was when people began stopping their wagons on the rutted road that ran from Brandon to Joseph. A widow turning the prairie inside out was the kind of sight that did not pass unnoticed in a country where every hour of dry weather mattered. Fences needed mending, hay needed cutting, smokehouses needed filling before the first hard freeze. And here, less than a mile from the river crossing, a 34-year-old woman in a faded gray dress was stacking the ground itself against her late husband's house. Daniel Ostrom had died in early June. A young horse, half broken and uneasy in a thunderstorm, had thrown him hard against a fence post on the south pasture. He lived for 2 more days. The funeral was small. The grave sat under a single cottonwood, marked with a board Henrik had carved himself. After that, the town expected Margaret to do what most widows on the frontier eventually did: sell out, move in with a brother in Minnesota, marry again before winter. Instead, she had stayed. And then she had started cutting sod. The first person to put words to the mockery was a wheat farmer named Brandon Cleary, a tall, sunburned man who owned 3/4 sections south of the river and was known to talk more than he listened. He had ridden past the Ostrom place on his way back from the mill when he saw her lifting a block of turf onto the slowly rising wall. He stopped just long enough to lean over his saddle horn. "Mrs. Ostrom, you've already buried your husband once. Why are you burying his cabin too?" Margaret did not look up. She set the sod in place, pressed it down with the flat of her hand, and reached for the next block. Brandon waited a moment for an answer, did not get one, and rode on. He told the story at the general store that evening. Joseph Hatch, the storekeeper, laughed hard enough that he had to set down the coffee pot. By morning, the line had passed from porch to porch across both towns. "She's burying him twice." Some people repeated it as a joke. Others repeated it the way the prairie repeated bad weather, without thinking, simply because the words moved easily. Within a week, nearly everyone on the wagon roads between Brandon and Joseph had a version of the story. Some embellished it. Most did not need to. What none of them knew, and what Margaret never offered to explain, was that the wisdom guiding her hands had not begun in Dakota. It had begun on a windswept farm above a fjord in southern Norway, in a house her grandmother Ingrid had grown up in. A torvhus, a turf house. Walls of stone and timber sheathed in living earth, the roof a sloping garden of grass and wildflowers in summer, and a thick frozen blanket in winter. Ingrid had described it the way other women describe their mothers, with patient familiarity. The earth does not fight the cold. It hides from it. Build your walls of something the wind cannot wear out, and the wind will go looking somewhere else. Margaret had been 17 when she heard those words. She was 34 now. And somewhere between the funeral in June and the first cold night in September, she had decided the time had come to listen. The cutting of sod was not the kind of work most women on the Dakota frontier were expected to do. It was heavy, slow, deliberate labor, the sort of task usually reserved for hired men or grown sons. Each block had to be sliced cleanly from the prairie with a long-bladed spade, then lifted intact, root and soil pressed together so tightly that the grass on top still seemed to be growing as it was carried. Margaret had learned the technique from her father, a quiet Norwegian carpenter who had homesteaded near the river in '68, and who had built the family's first dugout shelter from the ground he had broken with his own hands. She had been 12 years old that first winter. She remembered the smell of the earth more clearly than she remembered the cold. Now, decades later, the same motions came back to her without thought. She would set the blade at an angle, push with her boot until she felt the prairie give, and then lift. Block after block. Henrik worked beside her when he could, and when he tired, she sent him to the well or to the wood pile or to gather kindling from the cottonwood grove down by the creek. She never raised her voice. She never explained more than she had to. The work itself was the explanation, and the work was not yet finished. By the second week, the north wall of the cabin was almost entirely covered. The sod had been laid in overlapping courses, grass side down on the lower layers, grass side up on the upper, so that the roots from one block would knit into the soil of the next as autumn moisture seeped through them. The wall was thickening. Not just rising, but growing outward, until the cabin began to look less like a structure and more like a low hill that someone had placed a chimney on. From the road, the original logs were already becoming difficult to see. Joseph Hatch came out one afternoon to deliver a small order of nails and lamp oil that Margaret had paid for in advance. He had known Daniel Ostrom since the man first walked into the store 5 years earlier, asking about land. He had liked Daniel. He had not disliked Margaret, but he had also not understood her, and a man who did not understand a woman often filled the gap with opinions instead. Joseph dismounted near the front of the cabin, looked at the wall, and then looked at Margaret. "You know, ma'am, a cabin needs to breathe. Pack dirt against logs like that and you'll have rot inside 2 winters. His voice was not unkind. He believed what he was saying. Most of the men in Brandon and Joseph would have said the same. Margaret set down her spade and wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. "The logs are coated in pine pitch. My husband sealed them last September. The sod will not touch the wood directly." Joseph blinked. He had not expected an answer at all, and he certainly had not expected one that addressed his exact concern. He looked at the wall again. He could see now, where the morning sun struck the lower course, that there was indeed a thin gap of dark, glossy material between the logs and the earth. Daniel had been particular about his work. Joseph remembered that too. He nodded once, set the small parcel of nails and oil on the porch step, and rode back toward town without saying anything else. The story he told at the store that evening was a quieter one than Brandon Cleary's had been. He still thought she was wasting good autumn weather, but he no longer thought she was a fool, and he said so, in his own roundabout way, which was the closest a man like Joseph Hatch ever came to taking a position. A few of the regulars listened. Most went back to laughing. The nickname had taken hold by then, and nicknames on the prairie were harder to bury than husbands. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table by the light of a single lamp and unfolded a letter she had read so many times that the paper had begun to soften along the creases. It was written in her grandmother's hand. Ingrid Ostrom, born 1808, died the previous March in a small town in Iowa, had spent the last winter of her life writing things down for the granddaughter she would never see again. The letter was 4 pages long. Margaret had nearly memorized it. She read it again anyway, slowly, the way some people read scripture. The letter was written in a careful, slanting hand, the kind taught in Norwegian village schools half a century earlier. Ingrid had not always been an old woman bent over a writing desk in Iowa. She had grown up on a small holding above the Lysefjord, in a house her great-grandfather had built from stone and birch logs and living turf. The letter began with a description of that house. 3 rooms. A stone hearth at the center, walls thick enough that a grown man could not have spanned them with his arms outstretched. A roof of grass so heavy that goats sometimes climbed up and grazed there in summer. Ingrid had written about it the way another woman might have written about a child she had lost, with a tenderness that did not quite hide the grief beneath. The middle pages were practical. Ingrid had known, in her last winter, that Margaret was alone now in Dakota with a young son, and a cabin that had been built quickly and cheaply by a man who had run out of summer before he ran out of plans. So she had set down instructions. How to cut sod when the ground was still soft enough to take a clean blade, but late enough in the season that the grass had stopped its hard growing. how to lay the blocks so that the roots faced each other and grew together over the wet weeks of October, how to leave a small airspace at the eaves so that warm air from the cabin could rise without becoming trapped, how thick the walls needed to be, measured in the length of a forearm to keep a small fire warm against the worst kind of cold. The instructions were specific. They were also, Margaret understood now, very old. Ingrid had not invented them. She had only carried them. The last page of the letter was different. It was shorter. The handwriting was less steady. Ingrid had been ill by the time she wrote it, and she had known. The cold does not push, she had written. The cold pulls. It pulls the warm out of a house, out of a body, out of a life, until there is nothing left to take. A wall of stone fights the pull. A wall of wood resists for a while. But a wall of earth does not fight at all. The earth is already cold. The cold has no reason to take from what it already owns. So the earth turns the cold aside and the warm stays where you put it. Below that, in even smaller writing, Ingrid had added a single line. They will laugh at you. Let them. The winter does not laugh. Margaret folded the letter and set it back inside the small wooden box where she kept it, along with her grandmother's silver thimble and a lock of Daniel's hair tied with a strip of blue thread. She blew out the lamp. Outside, the prairie wind had begun to move through the dry grass in the long, hissing way it sometimes did in late October. Henrik was already asleep in the loft. Myra was curled against the warm stones of the hearth. Margaret stood at the window for a long time before she went to bed. The moon was up. The half-finished sod wall along the north side of the cabin looked, in the silver light, like the shoulder of a sleeping animal. She woke before dawn. She always did now. The grief came easiest in the early hours, when the cabin was quiet enough that she could hear Daniel's absence as clearly as she had once heard his breathing. So she rose, dressed in the dark, made a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and went outside to work. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale when she lifted her first block of the morning. By the end of the third week, the north and west walls were finished. The work was harder than she remembered her father's being, but she was older now and alone, and the prairie did not care about either of those things. Henrik had become quietly indispensable. He no longer asked when they would be done. He had begun, instead, to ask what came next. Margaret would point to the eastern wall, or the southern, or the roof, and he would nod and fetch what was needed without complaint. He was learning something she had not been able to teach him with words. The talk in Brandon and Joseph had not stopped during those 3 weeks. If anything, it had grown. A widow burying a cabin made for a good story in October when the harvest was in and the thrashing was done and men had time to lean against porch rails and pass judgment on the choices of others. The phrase Brandon Cleary had coined kept circulating, sometimes word for word, sometimes adjusted to suit the speaker. She's burying him twice. She's making him a second grave. She's filling in the windows like she means to crawl in and pull the prairie shut behind her. The cruelest version of the line came from a young man named Frank Halloran, who had a loud voice and a louder laugh, and a habit of repeating other men's jokes as though he had thought of them. Frank was 26 years old, married 3 years, with 1 son and another child on the way. He ran a small cattle operation east of Brandon, on land he had bought cheap from a homesteader who had given up after the grasshopper years. He was not a bad man in the strict sense. He paid his debts. He went to church when his wife reminded him. He had once, 2 summers earlier, pulled a stranger's wagon out of a creek bed without asking for thanks. But he was the kind of man who needed an audience the way other men needed sleep, and the sunflower of the season, in Frank's case, was the sod-covered cabin a half-day's ride from his own front door. He had taken to riding past the Ostrom place on his way home from town, even when it was out of his way, just to see what she had done that day. He never stopped. He never spoke to her. He simply slowed his horse to a walk, looked, and then carried the latest update back to whichever porch or store counter he found first. By the middle of October, he had begun referring to the cabin as the grave house. The name did not catch on the way Brandon's original line had. It was meaner than most people in Brandon and Joseph wanted to be out loud. But Frank used it anyway, and a few of the younger men used it after him, and Margaret heard it eventually, the way she heard everything eventually, because the prairie was a small place pretending to be a large one. She did not answer the name. She did not answer any of the names. Her silence was not the silence of someone who had not heard. It was the silence of someone who had decided early on that the breath required to defend the work was breath better spent on the work itself. Henrik noticed. Children always noticed. One evening, while they were eating a thin stew of potatoes and salt pork at the kitchen table, he asked her, in the small, careful voice he had developed since his father's death, whether the men in town would stop laughing when the cabin was finished. Margaret considered the question for a long moment before she answered. "No," she said, "not when it is finished. Maybe when it is needed." Henrik thought about that. Then he nodded and went back to his stew. He did not ask again. The eastern wall went up faster than the north or west had. The ground was beginning to harden by then, and Margaret had to work harder for each block, but she had also grown stronger over the weeks, and the rhythm of the work no longer cost her the same energy it had at the beginning. By the last days of October, 3 walls of the cabin were sheathed in turf nearly 2 feet thick. Only the southern wall, where the door was, and the roof remained. The roof was the part that worried her most. Her grandmother's letter had been specific about it. The roof needed to slope, not steeply, but enough to shed water in the wet weeks of spring. It needed a layer of birch bark or oiled canvas beneath the sod to keep moisture from soaking through into the cabin, and it needed to be thick. Thicker than the walls because heat rose, and a thin roof would let the warm out as fast as a thin wall would let the cold in. Margaret did not have birch bark. She had 2 old oilcloths from Daniel's wagon. She had decided they would have to be enough. The roof took 8 days. Margaret built a framework of cottonwood poles first, laid across the existing log rafters at a gentle outward slope, and spiked them down with the last of the heavy nails Daniel had ordered from Yankton the previous spring. Over the poles she spread the 2 oilcloths, overlapping them at the center ridge by nearly a foot, weighting the seams with flat creek stones that Henrik gathered 1 bucket at a time. Then came the sod. She had saved her best blocks for the roof. The thickest ones, the ones with the deepest root mats, the ones whose grass had been longest and whose soil had held together most stubbornly when she lifted them. She laid them in courses just as she had on the walls, but with extra care at the eaves, where the wind would try hardest to lift them, and at the peak, where the snow would settle deepest. She worked on a ladder Daniel had built the year before. It was not quite tall enough for the new height of the cabin, and she had to stretch on the topmost rung to set the upper blocks. Henrik stood at the base of the ladder and held it steady. He had grown solemn during the roofing. Margaret understood why. To watch a child watch his mother work above his head, knowing there is no one else to catch her if she falls, is to watch a child grow older than he should be. She tried to come down often. She tried to let him see her on the ground, drinking water from the bucket, eating a piece of bread, laughing at something Myra did. The cat had taken to climbing the half-finished roof at dusk and surveying the prairie from the peak like a small gray sentinel. Henrik laughed at that. Margaret was grateful for the laughter. On the 7th day of roofing, Frank Halloran rode past the cabin and saw her at the top of the ladder, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair pulled back under a faded blue kerchief, lifting a block of sod that must have weighed half what she did. He stopped his horse. He had not meant to stop. The horse seemed to stop on its own, the way horses sometimes do when their rider's attention has drifted. Frank watched her set the block, press it down, and reach for the next one. He watched her step down 2 rungs, move the ladder, climb back up. He watched her do this 3 times before he realized he had been sitting there for several minutes without moving and without speaking. He did not call out. He did not offer help. He turned his horse and rode on, faster than he had come. That evening at the general store, he did not say anything about her at all. Joseph Hatch noticed. Joseph Hatch noticed most things. He did not remark on it. But he made a small private note, the way storekeepers do, that something in the air around the Ostrom cabin had begun to shift. By the last day of October, the roof was finished. The cabin no longer looked like a cabin. It looked, from any distance greater than a stone's throw, like a low green mound rising out of the prairie, with a stone chimney pushing up through the center of it and a wooden door set deep into the southern face like the entrance to a burrow. The grass on the walls and roof had begun to knit together over the weeks of cool, damp weather, sending pale new roots from one block into the next, so that what had been thousands of separate pieces of turf was becoming, slowly, a single living skin. Margaret stood in the yard at dusk and looked at her work. Henrik stood beside her. Myra sat on the doorstep, washing one paw with great seriousness. "It looks like a hill," Henrik said. "It is a hill," Margaret answered. "We live inside it now." He thought about that for a long time. Then he reached up and took her hand. They went inside together. The cabin smelled faintly of damp earth and pine pitch and the small applewood fire she had lit in the stove an hour before. The walls were warmer than they had ever been at this time of year. Margaret noticed it the way a person notices the absence of a sound that has been there for so long they had forgotten it was there. The first week of November brought a kind of weather the old hands in Brandon and Joseph had been watching for since the leaves turned. Cold mornings that did not warm by noon. A sky that held its gray light longer than it should have. Birds that should still have been on the prairie were gone. The horses in the livery yard stood facing east, away from the wind, with their ears tipped back in a way that the old freighters knew to read. Something was coming. None of them said the word blizzard out loud yet. Saying it too early was bad luck, and bad luck in November was the kind of luck that killed people. Margaret had been watching too. She had been watching since the geese left in the third week of October, earlier than any year she remembered. She had been watching since Myra began carrying her food into the cabin instead of eating it on the porch, the way she had done every fall and winter Margaret had owned her. Animals knew things. Old women knew things. And Margaret, at 34, had begun to understand that she was becoming one of those old women whether she had asked to or not. She laid in extra wood. She filled every container in the cabin with water from the well. She brought the lamp oil indoors and set it on a shelf beside the stove. She checked the door for the third time and added a thick strip of felt to the bottom edge, where she had felt a small draft on a cold night. She also did one thing that no one watching from the road would have understood. She walked the perimeter of the cabin with a wooden mallet and a handful of small wedges cut from a length of pine, and she tapped the sod gently along the lower courses, listening for any place where the blocks had not yet fully knit to the wall. Where she found a hollow sound, she drove a wedge between the logs and the turf, and pressed in a handful of moss she had gathered from the creek bed. She did this slowly, methodically, working her way around the entire cabin twice. It took her most of an afternoon. By the time she finished, the sun was already low. She came inside, fed Henrik a supper of bread and warm milk, and sat by the stove with her grandmother's letter open on her knees, not reading it, just keeping it near. On November 14th, a Friday, the sky finally said what it had been thinking. The morning began clear and so cold that the inside of the cabin window had a film of ice on it when Margaret woke. By mid-morning, a thin haze had drawn itself across the western horizon. By noon, the haze had thickened into a wall of gray-white cloud that moved toward the river faster than any cloud had a right to move. The wind came ahead of the snow, the way it usually did. It came first as a long, low sound across the prairie grass, then as a series of hard gusts that rattled the chimneys in Brandon, and finally as a steady, building roar that did not stop and did not lessen and would not lessen for 4 days. The snow began at 1 in the afternoon. By 2, the road between Brandon and Joseph had disappeared. By 3, the fence lines were gone. By 4, a man standing on his own front porch could not see his own front gate. Temperatures fell faster than any thermometer in either town was prepared to measure. The Brandon mercury, hanging outside the post office, dropped past 0 by suppertime and kept falling. People who had ventured out in the morning for errands and not yet returned by afternoon became, by evening, the subject of quiet, urgent conversations conducted in low voices around kitchen tables. 2 of those people were brothers. Robert and Andrew Hartley, 28 and 24 years old, had ridden out the day before to check on a small herd of cattle they kept on a leased section 7 miles north of Joseph. They had planned to return that evening. They had not. When the storm broke on Friday afternoon, their mother, Eliza Hartley, was already standing at her front window with one hand pressed against the cold glass and the other gripping the edge of the curtain so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Eliza Hartley would stand at that window for most of the next 4 days. She would not eat much. She would sleep only in short, broken stretches in a chair her husband moved beside her so she would not collapse. The neighbors who came to sit with her brought soup and bread and quiet company, and they took turns watching the road with her, because watching alone for that long was the kind of thing that could break a person. The wind never paused. The snow never thinned. By Saturday morning, drifts had climbed past the lower windows of houses in Brandon, and by Saturday night, the schoolhouse roof at the edge of Joseph cracked under the weight of accumulated snow and gave way in a single long groan that the families on the nearest street heard even above the storm. There were no children inside. The schoolmaster had sent them home Friday at noon, against the protests of 2 boys who had wanted to finish a game of marbles. That decision saved 9 lives. People remembered it for years afterward. Other things broke that weekend that could not be repaired by morning. The Peterson family's barn collapsed before dawn on Sunday, killing 2 milk cows and a young saddle horse that had been a wedding gift from a brother in Minnesota. A widower named Olaf Bergstrom, who lived alone in a small wood-framed cabin on the western edge of Brandon, was found by his nearest neighbor on Monday morning sitting upright in a kitchen chair with his hands folded in his lap and the stove gone cold beside him. He had been 71 years old. His cabin had been built well by his own account, but the walls had been thin, and the wind had found every place where the chinking had shrunk in the dry autumn. The neighbors who carried him out wrapped him in a quilt his late wife had stitched and did not speak much on the walk back to town. The Hartley brothers were found on Tuesday, half a mile from a line shack they had been trying to reach. Andrew, the younger, had taken off his coat at some point in the last hours and laid it across his brother's shoulders. The men who found them did not say much about that either. There are some things on the frontier that get spoken of only once, at the burial, and then are folded into silence afterward, where they belong. While all of this was happening across the basin and the towns, and the long, lonely stretches of road between them, the cabin a half-day's ride from Brandon stood quiet under its blanket of frozen turf and accumulating snow. Inside, Margaret Ostrom had banked the small applewood fire in the stove down to a steady glow that needed feeding only once every 3 hours. She had lit one lamp and placed it on the kitchen table. The thermometer she had hung on the wall opposite the stove, a small brass instrument her father had given her as a wedding gift, read 52 degrees Fahrenheit at the worst hour of the storm and never fell below 50. The walls did not creak. The roof did not groan. The wind, which she could hear faintly through the door, sounded as though it were happening somewhere else, in a country she had once visited and no longer lived in. Henrik read at the kitchen table. He had only 3 books, 2 of which had belonged to his father, and he had read all of them already. But he read them again now because there was nothing else to do, and because reading was what his mother did when she was thinking, and he had begun, in the months since Daniel's death, to copy his mother's habits in the unconscious way of children who have lost a parent, and are trying to hold the family steady by becoming a small version of the one who remains. Myra slept on a folded shawl beside the stove. Margaret cooked. She made bread on Friday night, a stew of dried beef and onions on Saturday, a thick porridge with molasses on Sunday morning. She kept water boiling on the back of the stove at all times. She did not know yet that she would need it for anything other than tea and washing. She would find out on Sunday afternoon when the first knock came at the door. The knock was so faint that Myra heard it before Margaret did. The cat raised her head from the shawl and turned both ears toward the southern wall. Margaret set down the wooden spoon she had been using to stir the porridge and listened. For a moment she heard only the muffled sound of the wind, which had not changed its voice in 2.5 days. Then she heard it again. A small sound. Not the wind. Not the cabin settling. Something deliberate. She moved to the door and pressed her ear against the felt-lined wood. Henrik had stood up from the table without being told. Myra had risen and crossed the room and was now standing at Margaret's feet, looking up at her with the steady yellow attention cats give to things they have already understood and are waiting for their humans to catch up to. Margaret unlatched the door and pulled it inward. The wind hit her like a hand. Snow came in immediately, in a hard gust that scattered across the floorboards and dusted the front of her apron. She had to lean forward against the force of it to see anything at all. What she saw was a child, a small one, 5, maybe 6 years old. He was standing in the snow that had drifted up against the southern wall of the cabin nearly to the level of the doorstep, and he was so caked in ice and frost that for a moment she thought he was a statue someone had left on her porch. His lips were blue. His eyes were open but glassy. He was not crying. Children that cold did not cry. Crying took energy the body could no longer spare. Behind him, half collapsed against the snowdrift, was another child, a girl slightly older, and behind her, 2 more small shapes that Margaret could not at first identify as children because they were lying down and the snow had already begun to cover them. She moved without thinking. She pulled the first boy across the threshold by the front of his coat and pushed him into Henrik's arms with a single word: blankets. She stepped out into the storm in her house shoes and her apron and lifted the girl, who weighed almost nothing, and carried her inside and set her on the rug in front of the stove. Then she went back out for the 2 who were lying down. The wind was so loud that she could not hear her own breathing. The cold was so sharp that her bare hands went numb in the seconds it took to reach the smaller shapes. She carried them in one at a time, the smallest first, a boy of perhaps 4, and then a girl of 7 or 8 who was the heaviest and who she had to half-drag the last few feet across the floor because her arms had begun to fail her. She shut the door. She latched it. She turned and looked at what she had brought into her cabin. 4 children, none of them hers, all of them alive but only just. The oldest girl was beginning to shiver, which was good because shivering meant the body was still trying. The youngest boy was not shivering, which was bad, because it meant his body had given up trying and was preparing in the slow, patient way bodies do to stop. Margaret had seen this once before on the night her husband died. She knew what it meant. She knew what had to be done in the next hour. She knew there might not be an hour. She stripped them. All 4 of them, down to their underclothes, which were also damp and had to come off. And she did this quickly and without ceremony, because modesty was a luxury that belonged to warmer rooms. She wrapped each of them in a separate blanket from her own bed and from Henrik's loft. She set the oldest girl closest to the stove and the youngest boy in her own lap, because the youngest boy needed the warmth of another body, and there was no other body warm enough to give it but hers. She told Henrik to fetch the kettle. She told him to bring the small brown bottle of camphor from the shelf above the door. She told him to feed the stove until the iron of it was nearly red and then to stop, because she did not want a fire, she wanted heat. He did all of it without speaking. He had become, in the space of 5 minutes, older than 10 years old. She would think about that later. She did not have time now. The next 2 hours were the longest of Margaret Ostrom's life, longer even than the 2 days she had sat by Daniel's bedside in June while he slipped slowly away from her. The difference, this time, was that she had work to do. Grief sat still. This did not. She moved between the 4 children in a slow circle, checking pulses with her fingers against the soft places under their jaws, listening to their breathing with her ear close to their mouths, rubbing their hands and feet with the camphor she had warmed in a tin cup on the back of the stove. She poured tablespoons of warm broth between their lips when their lips could close around a spoon. For the youngest boy, the one in her lap, she dipped a clean cloth in the broth and pressed it gently against his mouth, letting the warm liquid seep in drop by drop, the way her mother had once shown her how to feed a newborn lamb whose ewe had died. She learned their names slowly as they came back into themselves. The oldest girl was Elsie Lindquist. She was 9. Her younger sister, the one Margaret had carried in second, was Bertha, 7. The 2 younger children were not Lindquists. The 4-year-old boy in her lap was Tommy Halloran. The other small boy, 6 years old, was his older brother Samuel. Margaret heard the name Halloran and did not let her face change, because Elsie was watching her, and Elsie was the kind of child who watched everything. But her hand tightened, just slightly, against the small shoulder of the boy in her lap. The story came out in pieces over the next hour in Elsie's careful, frightened voice. The Lindquist farm was a mile and a half north of the Halloran place. The two families had been close. Elsie and Bertha had been at the Halloran cabin on Friday afternoon, helping Mrs. Halloran with the baby, who was sick with a cough. Frank Halloran had ridden out before noon to look for a calf that had gotten loose in the night. He had not come back. When the storm hit at 1, Mrs. Halloran had sent the 4 older children to the root cellar with blankets and a lantern, because the root cellar was dug into the side of a low hill, and she remembered her own mother saying that the earth held warmth in a way that walls did not. They had stayed there through Friday night and all of Saturday. On Sunday morning, the lantern had run out of oil. The blankets were no longer enough. Mrs. Halloran had not come down to them. They did not know why. Elsie had remembered then the cabin a half-day's ride south of the Halloran place, the grave house, the one Frank had laughed about at the supper table only the week before. Elsie had not laughed. Elsie had listened the way children listen, and she had remembered that the widow's cabin was buried in earth like a root cellar was buried in earth, and that earth held warmth. She had told the others. They had argued. Samuel had wanted to wait for his father. Tommy had wanted his mother. Elsie had told them their father was not coming and their mother could not come, and then she had taken Tommy's hand and Bertha's hand and told Samuel to follow, and they had walked out into the storm. They had walked for almost 5 hours. Elsie did not remember most of it. She remembered the wind. She remembered Tommy crying and then stopping crying, which she had known was bad. She remembered seeing, finally, through a brief gap in the snow, the long, low shape of the widow's cabin rising out of the prairie like a hill, with a thin line of smoke coming up from the middle of it. She did not remember knocking on the door. She thought maybe Samuel had knocked. She was not sure. Margaret listened to all of this without interrupting. When Elsie finished, Margaret reached across the small space between them and put her hand against the side of the girl's face. "You saved them," she said. "All 3 of them. You saved your sister and you saved those 2 boys. Do you understand me? You did that." Elsie's eyes filled. She did not cry. She only nodded slowly, the way a person nods who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told she can set it down. The storm broke on Tuesday morning, the 18th of November. The wind fell off in the small hours, the way blizzards sometimes ended, not gradually but all at once, as though something far out on the prairie had finally finished what it had come to do and gone home. By dawn the sky was a pale washed blue, and the snow lay across the basin in long smooth drifts that had erased every road, every fence, every familiar landmark between Brandon and Joseph. The silence afterward was almost as hard to bear as the noise had been. People in both towns stepped out of their houses and stood on their porches and looked at a world they did not recognize. The first search party out of Brandon was organized before noon. 12 men on horseback, with shovels and ropes and a wagon pulled by a team of heavy bays. They moved slowly because the snow was deep and because every farm along the way had to be checked. They found the Peterson barn collapsed. They found Olaf Bergstrom in his chair. They reached the Halloran place by mid-afternoon and found Mrs. Halloran alive in the cabin with the sick baby still in her arms, both of them weak but breathing, the stove still burning on the last of the wood. She told them, in a voice that was barely a voice, that her 4 older children had gone to the root cellar on Friday and that she had not been able to reach them since. The men dug down to the cellar door. The cellar was empty. The party split. Half stayed at the Halloran place to care for Mrs. Halloran and search the outbuildings. The other half, 6 men now, rode south. Frank Halloran was among them. He had been found alive on Monday afternoon by a neighbor, half frozen in the lined shack he had taken shelter in when the storm caught him, and he had insisted on joining the search the moment he could stand. He rode at the front. He did not speak. The men with him did not press him to. They reached the Ostrom cabin a little before sundown. From a distance, in the long low light of the November afternoon, the cabin looked exactly as it had looked from the road for the past month. A green and white mound rising out of the prairie, with a stone chimney pushing up through the center of it and a thin, steady line of smoke climbing into the clean, cold sky. The men reined in their horses and looked at it. None of them said anything for a long moment. Then Frank Halloran swung down from his saddle and walked the last 50 yards on foot, alone with his hat in his hand. Margaret opened the door before he reached it. She had heard the horses. She stood in the doorway in her gray dress and her faded blue kerchief, and behind her in the warm lamplit room, Frank Halloran saw his two sons sitting at a kitchen table, wrapped in quilts, eating bread and broth from wooden bowls. Tommy was on Henrik's lap. Samuel was feeding small pieces of crust to a gray cat. Elsie and Bertha Lindquist sat on the rug in front of the stove with their hair drying in loose damp ropes down their backs. All four children looked up when the door opened. Tommy saw his father and made a small sound that was not quite a word. Frank Halloran stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and did not move and did not speak. Margaret stepped aside to let him in. He came in. He knelt on the floor of the cabin he had called a grave house, and he gathered both of his sons into his arms, and he wept the way men weep when they have understood something too late to take back but not too late to carry forward. Margaret closed the door behind him. She put another small log into the stove. She set a fresh cup on the table for him and a bowl, and she ladled out broth. The following spring, when the snow was gone and the prairie was green again, Margaret Ostrom stood in her yard with her grandmother's letter in her hand and read it aloud to 31 of her neighbors. Frank Halloran was among them. So were Brandon Cleary and Joseph Hatch. By the autumn of 1880, 14 cabins in the basin wore walls of sod. By 1885, no one in Brandon or Joseph called the practice strange. They called it sense. And somewhere in a small wooden box beside a silver thimble and a lock of dark hair, an old letter rested, its work finally finished.